Well, good morning, everyone. Jeremiah Poop, your friendly colonial Boston tour guide at your service as always. Sorry I didn't post yesterday. I had doctor's appointments and stuff. And I've been thinking a lot about history and genealogy. They're my twin passions, in case you haven't guessed by this point. And I got a little annoyed the other day because someone said to me, "Oh, what does this matter? Revolution, that's so long ago and stuff." Well, the past is not as far away as we often think it is. I mean, consider this. George Washington lived closer to our time than he did to Christopher Columbus's, and Cleopatra lived closer to our time than she did to the erection of the Great Pyramids, actually, and that's something to think about. And I remember, I was thinking to myself, because people sometimes ask me, who's the person who was born earliest that you knew? And that would be my great-great-grandfather, Nathan Bigelow, and he was born in 1879, and I do remember him because he lived to be over 100, and I knew him as a little kid. And so that means I met somebody who was born almost 150 years ago. And I thought to myself, well, Nathan, when he was a boy, knew people who were born in the 1700s. And here he is now, almost 150 years after his birth. There's people who knew him who are alive today. So he knew people who were alive when George Washington was, and he knew people who are alive today. So it shows you history is not all that far away. In fact, you could connect yourself to Abraham Lincoln, who was born 216 years ago and died 160 years ago. You could connect yourself to Abraham Lincoln in 6 degrees. Let's play a little game called 6 Degrees of Jeremiah Poop, if you will. And we'll use me as the first degree, because you know me. I mean, I know most of you probably have never met me in your life, but vicariously you know me through TikTok, so we'll say we know each other. We're all friends here, right? Kind of, sort of. But the thing is, you take, so you know me. When I was young, I had a mentor named Dr. John Gable, who was probably the world's reigning Theodore Roosevelt authority. And when he was a young guy, he had a mentor named Herman Hagedorn, who was a young immigrant from Germany who had known Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt is a young man, and President Teddy Roosevelt had John Hay in his cabinet, and John Hay was Abraham Lincoln's private secretary. So right there, you've got yourself, and then me, 1 degree, John Gable 2, Herman Hagedorn 3, Teddy Roosevelt 4, John Hay 5, Abraham Lincoln 6. So you see 6 degrees of separation between you and Abraham Lincoln. But I love genealogy, as I've said before, and I really got into it during the pandemic, because as you can imagine, during lockdown, there wasn't much for a humble tour guide to do with themselves, and I actually got into Ancestry.com. I've never really been into those DNA tests, because I think it's a little creepy to give somebody my DNA. I don't want them cloning me. I mean, last thing this world needs is another me. I think that's why I've never had children. I'm just like, this is going to end right now. This ends with me. I'm not going to pass down that weird bloodline of craziness. But I'll tell you this. My genealogy, my background is different. My father's side, predominantly Scottish and English and French Canadian. My mom's side, Irish, and surprisingly some African American, about 150, 200 years ago. You never guess it to look at me because I'm whiter than Wonder Bread, but yeah, true. And on my dad's side, some indigenous ancestry about 400 years ago, though that doesn't mean I'm Native American. I'm not a member of a tribe, nor should I be. But I did discover it was hard to trace back my Irish ancestry further than about 200 years, probably because the English destroyed all the records. But English ancestry, I could trace my English ancestors like 1,000 years. And I liked to use Ancestry because I wanted to know who these people were by name and by year of birth and year of date and stuff. And as I traced back, obviously, the majority of my ancestors were probably just ordinary people, but we know less about our ordinary ancestors because there's not as much records about them, whereas you'll find out more about your ancestors who were people of property and landowners. And as I was tracing back, I started hitting like people with like sir and lady, and I'm like, oh boy, titles. And then you get into like nobility. I'm like, oh please God, let me have a British king in my ancestry. And sure enough, I found that I was a direct descendant of King Edward III, and I'm like, oh my God, I'm royalty. And then I was reading this article in a genealogy forum, and it said, and by the way, virtually every person alive today with English blood is a direct descendant of King Edward III. And so, wow, so not special, actually. Everyone is special, so nobody is special. In fact, some genealogists and historians actually believe that every single person alive on the world today is actually a descendant of Cheops, the pharaoh, during the erection of the Great Pyramids 5,000 years ago or whatever it was. Think about shit. And I had kind of an amusing revelation when I was tracing my genealogy. I was tracing back, and I discovered a woman who had lived in Salem in the 1600s named Rebecca Town, and she was married to a guy named Francis Nurse. And I thought, oh wow, I wonder if he's related to Rebecca Nurse, who was the oldest person hanged in the Salem witch trials. And then I thought to myself, well, so she married him and she became Rebecca Nurse. I'm like, oh my God, that can't be. I can't be descended from Rebecca Nurse. I've talked about her on my Salem tours for years, and sure enough, it turned out I was a direct descendant not only of Rebecca, but of the man who killed her. It was Sheriff George Corwin, actually. So actually one of my ancestors killed another of my ancestors. No wonder I always feel so conflicted about everything in my life. I'm kind of like being pulled by two sides here, I suppose. And speaking of genealogy, I mean, I had, during the pandemic, I would play games where I try to figure out how I was related to my favorite celebrity, and quite often I could. And I played games where I'd try to randomly pick, like, people I'd grown up with, just ordinary friends from my hometown. And I would often find out, oh, we're seventh cousins, or we're eighth cousins, or something. It was quite strange. I remember about 3 summers ago, summer of 2022, I have so many stories from that summer for some reason. It was quite an eventful summer for me. I was in the parking lot of the Stop and Shop up in Swampscott, Massachusetts, excuse me, and I'd run into a friend of mine who teaches at Swampscott High School, and I hadn't seen her for a while, so we're just chatting in the parking lot and telling stories about our summer and stuff, and these 3 13-year-old skater boys come along, and one of them was actually the son of one of my best friends and his wife, and he had 2 of his friends with him, and they like came over and said hi to me. Well, the boy, he's like, hey, Poop. And one of his friends is like, how do you know this old guy? Thanks. And he's like, oh, he's friends with my parents. And the other kid's like, oh, is he cool or is he creepy? And my friend's son said, well, he's definitely not cool. Actually, he's kind of creepy. But he's like, not in a stranger danger kind of way, but more in kind of a, he's going to tell you like ghost stories and weird legends and weird history stories every time he sees you. And he's like, and they're really interesting the first 10 times you hear them, hint, hint. And it's true, I do have a little problem. My friends always say that I do tell the same stories over and over again. Like my best friend, I'll be telling him a story. I'll be like, did I tell you the one about? And he's like, yes, several times, but it's a good story, so tell it again. So I guess I'm kind of insufferable to the people who know me best. But my friend's son was like, Poop, you're into like doing family trees, right? That's what my dad told me. And I'm like, yeah, I guess so. And he's like, well, my friend here has a question. And apparently I met his friend, who's one of the other skater boys, and he said, yeah, my nan says that we're direct descendants of Paul Revere, but my dad says it's not true. It's just like some fake family legend. And I said, well, we can find that out right now on Ancestry.com and Family Search and Genie. I like to use several different ones just because sometimes, you know, you'll get different results. But if they all line up, then it's probably true. And within a few minutes, I was able to tell this kid, you know, because I'm like, just give me your grandparents' names and dates of birth and social security number. And I was like, just kidding about that, of course. And I said, is this on your mom's side or your dad's side? And the kid's like, well, my mom's 100% Japanese. So I'm like, yeah, we're probably not going to find Paul on that side of the family tree, then are we? So we'll go for your dad's side. And so we had him call his nan up, and she told me about her parents. And I looked her parents up on Ancestry and Family Search, and within a few minutes I was able to say, actually, you are Paul Revere's great-great-great-great-great-great-grandson. So, and the kid immediately calls dad, like, guess what, Dad, you were wrong. We're descended from Paul Revere. I've got the proof now. And I said, not only that, but you're also a direct descendant of Stephen Hopkins, who came over on the Mayflower, and he's my ancestor too. And it turned out me and this skater boy were like, you know, we were some like 10th cousins once removed or something. And then my friend like drove into the Stop and Shop parking lot to pick up his son, and my friend's son told his dad, he's like, Dad, Jeremiah found out that so-and-so is Paul Revere's descendant. He's like, oh wow. He's like, maybe it's true what you say, that everybody's like related if we trace back far enough. And he's like, let's figure out how we're related. And within a few minutes, I discovered that my friend was actually my 7th cousin. He's like, oh my God, we're related. He's like, gonna invite you to Thanksgiving. So, which he never did, by the way. But then again, 7th cousin isn't really that close, is it? But that's 3 years ago. My friend's son is now 16 years old. He's just started his junior year at Swampscott High, and he's actually gonna be playing football for their football team, the Big Blue, as they're called. So go Big Blue, and you know, go friend's son, whose name I won't say here, of course, to respect his privacy since he's a minor. Have a great day.